Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod.
Hello everyone and welcome to LawPod. My name is Eithne Dowds and I'm a lecturer here at the School of Law, and I'm very pleased to introduce today's episode, which features a conversation between myself and Jessica Elder, Student Welfare Officer at Queen's Students' Union, on the issue of consent within the context of rape and sexual assault. Over the past few months, there has been increased public interest in the issue of sexual assault, as well as the broader issues related to the investigation and prosecution of these crimes in Northern Ireland, following the high-profile case of the Rugby rape trial. An independent review into the criminal justice system's treatment of sexual offences has recently been confirmed, and it is to be led by the Right Honourable Sir John Gillen. So, just by way of background introductions, I joined the law school in September 2016 as a lecturer, and my research intersects the areas of international criminal law, feminist legal theory, sexual offences, and children born of sexual assault and conflict. My thesis examined the role of consent in an international criminal definition of rape, and I'm in the process of developing some of these ideas in a monograph I'm currently writing. And I would like to welcome Jessica Elder here today, and if you could just give us an introduction to yourself.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. My name's Jessica Elder. I'm the Vice President for Welfare in Queen's University Students' Union. I've been in post since 2016 and I did a nursing degree before that. I'm also the Welfare Officer for NUSUSI, which is the Northern Ireland national body for students who live in Northern Ireland. I've been in that post since 2017. And I suppose a lot of my work focused on consent education campaign through the Students' Union and now at a national level as well. So I suppose that's why I'm here today. I'm really interested in the conversation, so thanks for having me.
Okay, great. Thank you for coming. I suppose just to start us off, there's been a lot of media interest and different things around this issue of consent, and students in Queen's a couple of years ago, I think it was 2016, they launched the Stand Together survey. Yep. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about that in terms of what impact or input you had into that report and how it came about and what some of the results were.
Yeah, definitely. So the Stand Together survey was launched on the 9th of February in 2016. And I suppose it came about because there had been national surveys done before. There was one in the south of Ireland called the Say Something survey that was done in 2013, but it didn't cover students in Northern Ireland. Then there was a UK-wide survey that did cover students in Northern Ireland, but it only represented 0.2% of those students. And when we worked it out, or when the students worked it out, it was around 2 to 4 people that it represented. So it wasn't very representative of Northern Ireland. So they came together, mostly medical students, and decided that we needed to do an NI-wide survey. So they started the survey and it was launched then in 2016, and the results were launched in the summer of last year, just before we started the second launch of our campaign. I suppose the survey came about because of that reason, but also because there was such a lack of understanding on what was happening in Northern Ireland and in wider society, not just at Queen's. And I suppose 3,097 students filled that survey out, which is absolutely phenomenal. Even just for students at Queen's, the UK-wide survey was only over around 2,000 students had filled that out, and it was the same for the national survey in the south. So it was unprecedented amount of people had filled it out, and it wasn't just people who had experienced sexual assault. There were more people who had filled it out who hadn't. And I suppose a bit of the demographics was it was majority female had filled it out, with 63% who identified as female and 35% as male. 33% had experienced unwanted verbal comments of a sexual nature. 13.7% reported unwanted sexual comments. And 10.8% experienced unwanted touching of their private areas. And then they broke that down into attempted non-sexual sexual penetration and completed non-sexual sexual penetration. So there were 7.9%, which worked out to be 246 people had experienced at least one episode of attempted sexual penetrative assault, and 5.5% of people, which worked out as 169, experienced at least one episode of sexual penetrative assault. So it was very stark findings, and it was very difficult to read, and it was a great tribute to the students who sat down and worked with external organisations and internal people to write the report and analyse the data to provide such a strong report that has went on to ripple effect across the whole of Northern Ireland and the South. But one thing that really stood out for me was that there were a lot of people who described that they had experienced these things but didn't connect it to the definition of the law. And when they were asked if they felt that they had been sexually assaulted, only 5.6% of people said that they had, and a lot of people didn't know. So there's a huge disconnect between people experiencing these things and maybe not understanding what the law is.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important, and it's really commendable that the students who undertook this task were able to do it and got such overwhelming results, and that we now have this new data set that we can look at and try and understand. But as you say, whenever I was looking at the report, that figure of individuals not actually being aware, being able to label what they experienced as an assault or against the law is very, very worrying, but it just does demonstrate, as you say, that disconnect. So my research, I look at generally the issue of consent, and I have been looking at it within the international criminal context, so maybe not necessarily at the domestic, but I have looked at how domestic understandings and definitions can help inform our understanding at the international level. So around everything that's been happening in Northern Ireland over the past few months, I've been looking a little bit more at the law, and I'm aware anyway from my previous research that the law in Northern Ireland around sexual offending, which mirrors that in England and Wales, it defines rape generally around 3 core areas. Mm-hmm. So you firstly need to have a perpetrator penile penetrate the victim. Mm-hmm. So we see there that that's one particular idea of what rape is, this idea of penetration. You've also got that the victim does not consent. And the last element, which is really the fault element, is that the perpetrator did not reasonably believe that the victim consented. So that's really where we find that a case will an individual will be convicted on the basis of that, or they will not, this idea of reasonable belief. So there's those 3 elements that they have to look at, but in terms of what we understand consent to be as well, it's a very, very contested issue, although it's central to the prosecution of these crimes. And the Sexual Offences Northern Ireland Order did put forward a definition of consent. So prior to the order, which came about after overhaul of the legislation around sexual offences in 2008, there was no legislative definition. So it was just given its ordinary common sense meaning. And I think probably, as you're aware from the survey, there's a lot of disagreement and there's not a consensus as to what consent means. So that was quite worrying that was the legal stance prior to the order. So now we have a definition that says that consent is free agreement where an individual has the capacity to make that, has the freedom and capacity to make that choice. Now again, it's a little bit vague, but it's still better than just being given its ordinary meaning. But what you have then from that definition is that we look at whether the individual consents, but as I mentioned, it goes back to this idea of reasonable belief. And what we might look at in that, the legislation has another bit that says you have to actually look at the surrounding circumstances and any steps that the accused took to obtain consent. It's not saying they have to take steps, but you take that into consideration to determine whether the belief was reasonable. Now, prior to the order, there was only had to be an honest belief in consent, and that honest belief did not have to be reasonable. So that wasn't a very good starting point. But even though we have moved to this other area of reasonable belief, it's still contested, as I said, in terms of what we might use to demonstrate reasonableness. And this is where you see individuals then looking at the actions of the complainant as opposed to the actions of the perpetrator. And this is where we get victim blaming attitudes and different types of defence strategies. For example, asking questions about whether, if there was an alleged abuse between 2 individuals, why did the complainant not scream at that point? Why did the complainant not leave the room? Why did they not verbalise the no? Now, in law, there is no need for resistance. So you don't need that. You don't need a vocal no. But these methods are used nonetheless to try and undermine the complainant's position and to attach reasonableness to the actions of the perpetrator. So I think that that's where, again, we have the legal understanding, and then we have what do individuals, what might jurors, for example, understand consent or lack of consent to be. So I think just to bring it back maybe to what you've been working on and the initiatives that you've seen, has there been a really stark disconnect in terms of that understanding of, what consent is? And is there any awareness of what the actual legal criteria is, whether it's good, bad, or needs reformed?
Well, after I came into office, we ran a consent campaign in the first year I was in office, and we did have a panel debate on whether the law on rape is fit for purpose. And since then, it has been a core topic of conversation throughout the campaign. This academic year, then we ran a workshop, and we ran that in Elms Village, and over 400 people attended that workshop.
Okay, so Jessica, do you want to just tell us a little bit about where the workshops originated from, what they involve, and what students might expect when they attend?
So in the workshops that we run in our Consent is Bay campaign originated from NUI Galway. It was actually developed by a psychologist professor called Padraig McNeila and a sexologist called Siobhan O'Higgins. And it was a very good combination for them to come together because he came from a very statistic background, whereas Siobhan came from a very empowering, sex-positive background. And they both came together and developed a workshop. This workshop's called Smart Consent Workshop. They developed a workshop that had surveyed students in Galway and what their beliefs were and what they thought about consent and incorporated that into a workshop. So people come along to the workshop and it is delivered by consent ambassadors. Those ambassadors are recruited at the start of the year, with the majority of them being students who apply to be ambassadors, but also staff members in Queen's who have applied to also be ambassadors. So they're trained together. We get those professors up from Galway, and we also get some training from Nexus as well. So they're trained up to deliver the workshops, and they go out and deliver them with students. And students show up the workshop, and they do a survey before the workshop, asking them how they feel. Do they feel confident in communicating consent and talking about consent? And do they believe that verbal consent should be given before any sexual activity? Does this include kissing? Just to get a baseline of people's opinions before they go into the workshop. They come into the workshop and we do talk about a definition of consent. And if I can remember correctly, it is the freely given, non-verbal or verbal communication of consent that is ongoing. It talks about how it's freely given, that you shouldn't be under any influence, whether that's of another person as well. People don't talk about coercion of other people as well, that it's ongoing, that you can withdraw consent at any time. But before that, we actually ask students what they think the definition of consent is. And, because there's no definitive definition that fits everybody, we do use that one loosely. But people come in and they say all of those things. They say it should be freely given, that it should be, people talk about it verbal and non-verbal. So it's really interesting to see that people have that idea first before they come into a workshop. Throughout the workshop, we have scenarios and people are put into groups and they're given the scenarios and they're asked them whether they feel like consent has been given or not. They give a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or they're not really sure, and it's in the middle. And we facilitate that conversation in the groups. So one group could believe, yes, consent was given, and another group can believe, no, it wasn't given. So we ask why. Why do you believe that? Why do you think it wasn't given? And it's sort of a back and forth in the room. And then we can throw in some little devil's advocate things like, well, what about this? Or what about that? Or if they did this, what do you think about that? And we ask, what are better ways that consent could have been communicated, both verbally or non-verbally? So they pick out parts in the scenario where, if they were in that situation, where it would be better to have a better communication of consent. So that's really good to allow them to actually see a realistic scenario that could happen and where the best place would be in a group. And it's really interesting to see as well that people start to become more comfortable with more early verbal communication of sexual activity. So before you go back to somebody's house, is it, some people might say it's really weird to be like, do you want to go back to mine to have sex? Whereas somebody else would be like, no, that's perfectly fine, because you're letting them know verbally very early on what your intentions are and what you would like to do, because you're really interested to be with that person. Throughout the workshop, we also talk about what's good ways to communicate consent, yes and no. So can we take a break and things like that. or can we slow down for a minute, or I don't want to do that right now. And people say it's not sexy, but we turn it into a very sexy way. So I'm a very liberal person, and when we're in the workshop, I do say words that isn't penis or breasts. I do say other words, and I'll not say them on the podcast because that's the way people talk, and that's what we do as facilitators. We make them feel comfortable. We give them a space to talk about it. We facilitate the sessions backed up by statistics with scenarios, and we provide a space for people to talk about it with their peers. And I would consider myself one of their peers. I'm only 23. So that's the way the workshops run. And we do have really good positive feedback from that. And people do leave the workshops feeling that they're more comfortable in talking about consent. And interestingly enough, one of the scenarios is a situation where a young male and female go back to a house party, and the female asks the male if they would like to go upstairs to help with something. And when they get up there, they realise that the male realises that there was nothing to help with, and there starts the coercion and the pressure to engage in sexual activity. And the scenario goes through that even though he didn't want to, he had sex with the girl. And we asked students, was that rape or not? And people are really confused, and then lots of people will say yes. But then there's a huge conversation afterwards that, well, it can't be because a girl can't rape a boy. And I was like, well, if it was flipped around, how would you feel about the situation? And they were like, no, definitely, completely different. And that opened some people's eyes because they don't realise that the law is that. They don't realise that it has to be penile penetration, or that they don't realise that a woman can't rape a man by law, which actually causes a lot of anger and disbelief in the workshops because people don't realise that that's true, which can be a really good conversation to have. But I do feel like that the law isn't fit for purpose the way it stands. It's actually really interesting on the third part that you were talking about.
Fault element, so the reasonable belief in consent.
And that actually is really interesting because you can look at it from a different side of that, the belief that they don't understand on how to communicate consent. So if we're not taught how to communicate consent or what consent is, or that you need to have sexual consent, or when you're engaged in a sexual activity, then how can people understand that as well? But
yeah, well, that's actually really interesting because that style of definition, there's different variations of how we do define rape, and some of them, consent is central to our model. It's central to models in New Zealand, for example, in Australia, and also in South Africa. There's other models that take a circumstance-based approach, so consent doesn't feature in the explicit definition, but it's implied almost, but they look for different types of coercive circumstances, so force, threats, these different types of scenarios. But some research was carried out in 2016 by scholars in Australia. And what they did, because as you say, in the different educational workshops, and also generally in terms of some academic research that has been carried out into what rape is and how we understand consent, it's asking for general perceptions and general understandings, not actually saying, what do you think of the legal definition, and actually zoning in on that fault element and trying to look at, what do you understand as reasonable belief? What would you explore? What would you look at? So these scholars actually did a focused group with some legal professionals and community workers as well, who are looking at reforming the law. So they're familiar with it, but not, they don't know it fluently. And whenever the different elements were set out, it was that element that caused the most surprise, and it also caused the most criticism. Because as you say, if you're looking for reasonable belief in consent, reasonable belief in what? Like, what do we mean when we say consent? And also, they were given a scenario in terms of individuals participating in some sort of sexual activity, and then there's grey areas, there's different things that go on to try and let you think a little bit more about, is there consent, is there not, is there reasonable belief? And whenever they were looking at different scenarios, sometimes they would say, well, yes, I think that's rape, but I don't think it meets the legal definition. And the reason why they were saying that was because they think that given the high threshold of beyond a reasonable doubt, they don't think that could be met in terms of thinking through that issue of the perpetrator. The victim might not have consented, but the perpetrator reasonably believes that they did because of different circumstances that happened around that. So I think that, as you say, that is quite interesting, that maybe that's not something that everyone is completely aware of.
Yeah, but also people don't consent whenever they just don't say anything. Or people don't consent by not saying anything.
Yeah.
And also, I don't know, it just makes it a lot harder, and the threshold is a lot higher in your say. So there's a huge disconnect there from your scenarios as well, of what is actually happening and what the law says is happening.
Yeah.
Which is completely separate. It's completely different.
Yeah.
So what's happening with people who are engaged in sexual activity doesn't meet the law.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think we're in a position now that we really do need to reflect on how we understand this, because, as I say, we moved from a position where it was honest belief in consent. And the reason why you have that is because in criminal law, you punish people for blameworthy behaviour. So you need to find some sort of an intention. So that was the idea. If someone honestly believed that there was consent, then they weren't blameworthy, they couldn't be held responsible. Now we've moved to the more seemingly objective standard, but although it's influenced by different subjective understandings of what is reasonable. So in that research that I just mentioned, undertaken in Australia, one of the participants actually said, well, maybe we should think about not saying reasonable belief, but thinking about whether the accused took reasonable steps to obtain consent. So in our current law, it does say it'll take that into consideration, but it's not an explicit requirement. So should we move to that, which is taking on board this more affirmative, communicative type of understanding of what consent is and healthy sexual relationships? So I think also then from some of the research that I've carried out and looking at what do we mean by consent and how should we best approach it. In international human rights law, for example, there is evidence of what is known as like an equality approach. And that's where within the actual definition, you state that there must be consent expressed. So an individual must say yes. So you're not looking for whether they said no. So you can't take silence as implied consent, for example. You're looking for explicit communication in some way. Now, of course, that approach is also, subject to limitations and can be flawed in certain ways, because not every yes should completely mean yes. There can be underlying kind of power structures, different things that influence or impose
There's
that.
Also some people who just can't speak.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a really good point. There's a lot, as you point out there, there's a lot of different ways, I suppose, we are thinking about this, and I was just doing it there through a privileged lens in terms of my own experiences and different things. So there definitely is a wider conversation to move beyond this kind of heteronormative dominant understanding of what is sexual relationships. So I wonder, what about in terms of the workshops or initiatives or different things that you've been doing and you're looking at? Because I was talking there a little bit about like reform of the law, which is obviously, it can take a lot of time. And currently at the minute in Northern Ireland as well, we don't have a government. So I'm not really sure, how we could go down that path. But in terms of at a societal level, what measures do you think should be taken, and what are you working on at the minute that might be of interest in this area?
Yeah, well, we definitely need to have standardised education in secondary schools. That's the biggest thing. And everybody will say that. Any organisation out there trying to push the message of consent, and organisations and support organisations will always say that, because right now the sex education we get as young children or as adolescents in school could be so completely varied. So some places could, my sister recently got a talk from Nexus, which was unheard of a few years ago whenever I was in school. Some people just get talks from Precious Life, or don't get anybody coming in at all, and they're not taught anything, or they're taught just never to have sex. They're not taught about like consent or how to have a safe and healthy relationship or anything like that. And I think moving forward, we really need to, on a societal level, change the education that we deliver on that level. But also we need to be able to facilitate a wider conversation. So what we're doing with students in higher education empowers them almost to be able to, you come into a space that is dedicated to consent. Okay, maybe you didn't want to be there, but you're interested a bit. So you come along and you're there and you feel comfortable and you're relaxed and you're with other people who have the same mindset as you, like, maybe we don't want to be here, but we're here. We'll see what it's like. And you start to open a dialogue. And when you leave that workshop, and what we've seen, and we have a report to show that people feel more confident in talking about sexual consent afterwards in those workshops, is that they come in and they don't realise that everyone else around them is thinking the same thing. But they come into the workshop and they think, well, nobody thinks the way I do, or nobody thinks this, or nobody thinks that. We come in and they write down on a post-it note that's completely anonymous. They write it down, they stick it up, and actually you see that everybody's saying the same thing. And then they start to be like, oh, okay. Then we move on to scenarios and statistics, and we get to this thing called the rope task, which shows that even though when people were asked the question, do you think verbal consent should be gained before any sexual activity? And around 80% of people said yes. And then they were like, well, how do you think other people filled this out? And they said, 40% of people said yes. So the disparity there between what they believe and what they think everybody else believes, it's this perception in society that it's this hush-hush, like sexual activity is hush-hush, and it's very much like olden-timey, inverted commas, almost, that we can't communicate. But when you allow people to have that space and they feel confident, like we've had people, ambassadors, like those workshops are delivered by students who we've trained, and they go out and they talk with their housemates about it. And then their housemates are all having this conversation, who then go out to talk with their family about it, their friends. Like, I didn't know anything about consent before I came into this job, and now I've learned so much. My younger sister, I delivered the workshop to her. Like, am I a good sister or am I too involved in the topic? You decide. But, you know, now my family have conversations about consent in a really positive way, where my sister has talked to her boyfriend about consent, you know, and it's such a ripple effect. You just have to create a space that allows people to express themselves and understand and have the conversations and empower them to have those conversations. In the student movement, that's what we try to do anyway. Backing that up with lots of support and making sure that people know what procedures are in place, where they can go. On a societal level, we really need to start having that education from a younger age, being able to, you know, have funding for support organisations so that people can come forward and people can feel that they're not left alone and that they're on their own, that we have that space for people to talk, and we start to create a wider societal change in opinion and comfort in talking about sexual activity.
Yeah, no, I think you're completely right, because as you say, it is kind of this hushed or kind of shameful kind of understanding of what sex is, and, you know, people don't necessarily want to talk openly about it. People can get embarrassed. So I think it's really, really important, and the work you talk about, it just sounds like it's doing so well in terms of that ripple effect that you're talking about. And I even think it's a generational thing as well, because I find that in the research that I'm conducting and different things, say if I would be teaching students as well, sometimes you put forward these different scenarios, and I actually use them with like my mom, my dad, my sister, and different things. And it was very, very interesting to see what, you know, we thought, the different perceptions towards those scenarios. And as you say, this idea of empowerment, because if we don't empower people or let them understand what type of behaviour they're entitled to, or what type of, you know, behaviour and interactions they should be having with other people, then they're not going to use the law. They're not going to, you know, if they're not going to understand, if they feel, you know, bad about something, they're not going to understand that actually was wrong and that was abuse. So if we try to help, you know, at a societal level of understanding and talking about this a little bit more, then any eventual changes or adaptations to the law will be useful, because people can then apply their understandings to it. But if we leave this big disconnect and there's no cultural understanding and no talking about it, then if we're not going to move forward, there's not going to be more reporting and faith in the criminal justice system as well.
Yeah, and I think to move forward, we really need to start gaining bigger evidence base of what people are thinking out there. So doing focus groups and surveys and finding out what are we thinking as a society, where are we, like allowing people to feed into that conversation, because we are a collective society together. And I suppose in the student movement, after the SCORE survey, we've now moved on to doing a national survey, which is going to be for FE and HE. So not just higher education like Ulster and Queen's and St Mary's and Stranmillis, but also further education, because you have students there who will engage in sexual activity like everybody else. So I'm really looking forward to launch that survey, and we will be looking at the perceptions of people and what they think consent is, and possibly why people feel like they can't report, whether that's they don't understand the law, they don't think something's a crime, they feel too embarrassed, they don't know where to go, who to turn to, whether that then interprets that people should be engaging with victim organisations more. Do they need more funding? Do they need more resources? What do people want to see in the student, you know, on a society? And obviously our young people, like our student, we represent over like 240,000 students across Northern Ireland, and that's a huge proportion of people that will give us a really good idea of what change do we want to see. Do we want to see a change in law? Do we want to see that standardised sex education when we're younger, which students are the best people to ask because they've just went through it. Do we want more funding? Do we want what do we want to see? Do we want more campaigns? Do we want, you know, what do we want to see? And I think I'm really excited to have that survey, because it will, although this SCORE survey was just for Queen's students, this one is going to be so much wider, and I can't wait to see the ripple effect that will have if the SCORE surveys had the ripple effect that it has, and on an all Ireland level as well. USI, the Union of Students in Ireland, which is the national body for the whole of Ireland, they're going to be starting to do another survey as well to try and find out what are people thinking in the south. recently, NUS, the National Union of Students in England, Scotland and Wales, just did one on staff-student misconduct. So now we're starting to look at student-on-student misconduct, but also staff-on-student. And what are we doing in our institutions to try and create a great support base and a reporting system to get that message out there that we're zero tolerance and to provide that education to young people. So I think to be able to move forward as a society, we need to have that evidence base, and no better place than the student movement. We're great.
Yeah, no, I think it sounds like there's so much happening and there's a lot to come. So good luck anyone trying to collate all that data, but I think that
I'll be away. I just leave whenever all the work comes.
Well, I think that it'll be great to see what comes out, what needs to be done, and as you say, responding to the needs of individuals in society and listening to the voices of them rather than trying to impose different views on them. So I also think that this, as you say, it's part of a larger conversation on the issue of consent. It's also part of a larger conversation in terms of the trial processes and procedure around rape trials, as we see the independent review in Northern Ireland, which will be commencing in May. So I think I would just like to thank you for your reflections on the issue of consent, and good luck for everything that's going forward, and I really looking forward to see the results of the survey.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to say to any listeners out there that if you have been affected by anything we talked about in the survey, that you can contact Nexus or the 24-hour service domestic helpline that is available for anybody of any gender or sexual orientation. So please do get in contact with them if you need any support. Details of those will be in the show notes.
You have been listening to LawPod, an informed take on current events brought to you by the law students and staff at Queen's University Belfast. This episode was produced by myself, Eithne Dowds, Rachel Colleen and Richard Somerville. Our theme music is by Colonel Chocolate and the Justice Triangle. LawPod is funded by Queen's Law School and the Queen's Annual Fund. Thank you to Jessica Elder for coming to us today. You can follow us on social media. We are on Facebook and Twitter at QUB LawPod. For more information, you can also visit our website, lawpod.org, and please have a look in the show notes for more information about the topics covered today. You can find us on iTunes or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. I'm Eithne. This was LawPod.